Hi, I'm Catherine Porter. I'm an independent energy consultant, and in today's video I'm going to talk through what were the causes of the blackout that affected the whole of Iberia on the 28th of April and unfortunately cost 11 people their lives. There's been an awful lot of coverage about this, some people suggesting it's all the fault of renewables, some people suggesting it's definitely not the fault of renewables, and in this video I'm going to try and get to the bottom of it based on the reports that have been put out both by the Spanish government and by the Spanish electricity system operator Red Eléctrica de España, otherwise known as REE. Please excuse my croaky voice today as well. But before I get into that, I'm going to have to cover some of the physics of how alternating current works, because it turns out that the causes of this blackout were actually quite technical and come down to some pretty fundamental properties of our electricity grids that perhaps we've been overlooking in the rush to net zero. So let's hope we can get through this without too much difficulty. So let's bring up the slides. Right, so to begin with, we're going to talk about a couple of important components known as inductors and capacitors. These are some of the most basic building blocks of electrical circuits, and they sound more complicated than they are in fact. So inductors, which we can see in the diagram on the left here, are effectively passive two-terminal electric components that store energy in their magnetic field. And they resist changes in current. They're often referred to as coils or chokes. And an inductor typically consists of an insulated wire wrapped around a core, as we can see in this picture here. One way to visualize the action of an inductor is to imagine a narrow channel with water flowing through it and a heavy water wheel that has paddles dipping in the channel at the end of the channel. And imagine that there isn't water flowing to begin with. So then you get the water going, and the paddle wheel will actually try and prevent the water from flowing until it's come up to speed with the water. And then if you try and stop the flow of water in the channel, the spinning wheel will actually try and keep the water moving until the speed of rotation slows back down again to the speed of the water. And that's effectively what the inductor does with the flow of electrons in a wire. It resists change in the flow of electrons, and therefore the flow of current. Now actually, if you put two or more inductors in close proximity with each other so that their magnetic fields interact, you actually get a transformer, and that's a fundamental component of every power grid. It allows you to change voltages up or down. Now, we transmit voltages over large distances. We transmit electricity over large distances at high voltage because that reduces the amount of line losses we get. This was something that Nikola Tesla discovered back in the 19th century and is the fundamental reason, in fact, why we use alternating current in our power grids. But we wouldn't want such high voltages in our homes for safety reasons, and so we use transformers to step that voltage back down again when it comes to bringing it into homes and businesses. So that covers inductors. They basically resist changes in current and they store energy in their magnetic field. And then we have capacitors, and they're devices that store electricity by accumulating electric charges on two closely spaced surfaces that are insulated from each other. And in fact, they actually behave a little bit like batteries because they store electrical energy and they store that in their electric fields, although their method of doing that is different to a battery. Capacitors were actually originally known as condensers, and the earliest forms of capacitors date back to the 1740s, when European experimenters discovered that electric charge could be stored in water-filled glass jars that came to be known as Leyden jars. So one way to visualize the action of a capacitor, again, is to think about water. And this time, instead of a channel of water and a water wheel, we have a water tower connected to a pipe. And the water tower basically stores water pressure. So when the water system pumps produce more water than a town needs, the extra water is stored in the tower, and then at times of high demand, when you can't supply the water from elsewhere, that spare water comes out of the tower, and it helps to maintain pressure in the water pipes to allow water to move around the town as needed. And that's similar to a capacitor. It stores up electrons that can be used later on as needed. So then we have the question of reactive power. Now, this is a term that's used quite a lot in the power sector. It's a very important concept, but one that's generally quite poorly explained. When we hear the word power, normally we think about the energy that's being used to do something useful, like lighting a bulb or boiling a kettle. And that's what we call real power. But in AC electricity, we also have something called reactive power. And that isn't power that does work, such as heating and lighting, but it's still really important to the fundamental operation of power grids. So people quite often use this beer glass analogy, where the beer is the useful bit and the foam on the top is the useless bit. But that's a poor analogy, really, because reactive power isn't useless. It's actually critically important to the function of the power grid. And again, we'll come back to a water analogy. It's a little bit like the water pressure in a pipe. If you don't have enough pressure, the water won't flow, but if there's too much pressure, the pipe could burst. The pressure doesn't quench your thirst per se, so it's not useful in that sense, but without it, you wouldn't get the water to where it's needed. So in alternating current electricity, the voltage is effectively the pressure, and the reactive power helps control the voltage. And if you don't have enough reactive power, voltage will drop and equipment will stop working properly. And again, if you have too much, voltage can rise and equipment can get damaged. So alternating current, as we've talked about before, is where your current and your voltage alternate, as in they change direction. Now, if you have a simple circuit that only has resistors, so resistors we'll think of in terms of loads that do work, like a light, for example, or a motor, these consume power, but they resist the flow of current. And in those types of circuits, the current and the voltage move exactly together. So they reach their peaks and they reach their troughs at exactly the same time. However, when you introduce inductors and capacitors, then this picture changes. Now, in fact, there's really no such thing as a circuit that doesn't involve inductors or capacitors, because conventional power generators behave strongly like inductors, and power lines can behave like capacitors or inductors depending on how long they are. So as soon as you really connect a wire to a power station, you have a circuit that includes inductance or capacitance, and therefore you get reactive power, and you get a difference between the current and the voltage in terms of where their peaks and where their troughs appear. So inductors would tend to cause current to slow down. So basically then the current will reach its peaks and troughs later than the voltage will. And capacitors do the opposite. Capacitors, because they store electricity in they store energy in their electric fields, they tend to push the current forward, and therefore you'd get the current having its peaks and troughs earlier than the voltage does. And the ability to control current and voltage by adjusting this reactive power is really important within electricity grids. Electrical equipment, as I mentioned, has natural inductive or capacitive features, and they need to be taken into account when we look at alternating current grids. So just a final note on this. I mentioned that inductors store energy in their magnetic fields, and they do this as voltage increases, and capacitors release their energy at the same time. Now, often we hear people use this phrase that inductors absorb energy or reactive power, and capacitors release or create reactive power. This is a kind of a lazy shorthand, because it's really only true when voltage is increasing. When voltage is decreasing, the opposite happens. So as voltage decreases, inductors release energy from their magnetic fields and capacitors absorb it. So as you move through this alternating current cycle and the voltage goes up and down, through each cycle, as we can see in this slide, you'll have one half where inductors absorb energy and capacitors release it, and then the other half where the opposite happens, and this happens twice per one full cycle of voltage. Now let's talk a little bit about how electricity is made. So traditional power stations like coal, gas, nuclear and hydro use big spinning machines called synchronous generators. And these rely on a very fundamental principle where if you take one magnet and rotate it inside the magnetic field of another magnet, that will induce current in a wire. And this is alternating current because of the rotation effect. Now in Europe, our turbines rotate at 3,000 revolutions per minute to give current and voltage that varies at a rate of 50 cycles per second. So 3,000 divided by 60 seconds in a minute gives you 50 cycles per second, or 50 hertz. In North America, they rotate at 3,600 revolutions per minute, and that gives you a 60 hertz grid. And that's why we need to take adapters with us when we go on holiday to different countries, because they can use not just different plug types, but different voltages and different frequencies as well. So as well as having, and we've discussed this in a previous video, as well as having inertia, so that is these big heavy turbines resist changes to their speed of rotation, synchronous generators also control reactive power by adjusting the field in the electromagnets that create the electricity in the first place. So when I said that you have one magnet rotating inside the magnetic field of another magnet, those two magnets are electromagnets. So effectively wires wrapped around some metal, and the current is passed through those wires, and by varying the amount of current going through those wires, you change the strength of the magnetic field, and that changes the properties of the alternating current, the voltage and the current that gets then induced by that process. So if the magnetic field strength is increased, the generator will actually start to behave more like a capacitor and start pushing the current forwards to help raise voltage on the grid. And if the magnetic field strength is reduced, the generator will behave more like an inductor, and the current will lag behind the voltage and help to lower it. And this works because adjusting this excitation field changes the internal voltage that the generator tries to impose on the system. And the bigger the difference between the internal voltage and the grid voltage, the more reactive power will flow. So the more energy you'll be exchanging between your magnetic and electric fields. And so these machines don't just generate energy, they help to shape and stabilize the voltage that carries it. Now the question is, how are inverter-based resources such as solar panels, batteries and wind turbines different? So these types of assets, they don't generate synchronous alternating currents. So solar panels and batteries, they don't generate alternating current at all. They generate direct current straight away. Wind turbines will generate alternating current because they have a turbine that rotates, but it's not synchronous to the grid. It doesn't give you a stable 50 hertz. So you can't inject it into the grid in that form. So typically what happens is the alternating current generated by the wind turbine is converted into direct current and then converted back into alternating current using the same type of inverter, which is an electronic device, as you would have for solar and for batteries. Now, so they don't spin, they don't have the same natural rhythm as a synchronous generator, and they're not in line with the grid. So the first difference this creates is that the current they produce, the alternating current they produce, is dirty. So you can see this in this chart here, where your nice clean line is what you'd get from a synchronous generator, gas power station or nuclear or hydro, and the fuzzy one is what you get from an inverter. Already you have a less clear, less precise waveform for current and voltage. Now secondly, because they're not rotating, they don't possess natural inertia. Batteries can produce synthetic inertia because they can inject current very quickly, which is useful when frequency is falling, but wind and solar can't do that. Now, in theory, they could using something called grid-forming power electronics, but there are very few of those actually in use, partly because of technical difficulties and partly because the wind and solar generators would have to keep some of their capacity in reserve to use for inertia support, and if you're not using your whole capacity, that has an economic impact, and the frameworks to compensate for that haven't really been created yet. because keeping in mind this is basically something that you get for free with conventional generators. So now suddenly it's something you'd have to pay for with wind and solar, and if they're having to reduce the amount of electricity that they can sell day in and day out, then that could be quite a significant cost. Thirdly, inverters don't respond automatically to changes in voltage unless they're programmed to do so. Some are set up to help with voltage and reactive power, but many of the older or cheaper models, they just disconnect when the grid signals start to deviate from their normal parameters. And finally, there's a lot less visibility for system operators with inverter-based generation. Synchronous machines are predictable and grid operators know how they're going to behave, but inverters can behave differently depending on how their software is written or if different devices clash with each other. And that matters because when a grid is under stress, for example due to a fault or a disturbance, you need generators that will behave in a steady and predictable way. Many inverters that operate today still trip offline too easily and don't provide the voltage support the grid needs to recover from faults. It's a little bit like trying to run a marching band where half of the instruments are playing from a different sheet of music. Things get messy quickly. So, having set the stage, what happened to cause the blackout in Spain? So first of all, the system operator detected frequency oscillations at a low frequency of 0.2 Hertz. So this is a slow deviation that's overlaid on top of the 50 Hertz grid frequency. And this deviation completed a cycle every 5 seconds. And at the same time, voltage dropped and also became unstable. It started to oscillate. So the frequency and voltage oscillations shared a common cause, but they don't cause each other. So in the same way that sunshine will cause plants to grow and it'll cause people to get sunburn, plants growing doesn't give people sunburn and vice versa. They share this common cause, but they don't cause each other. So it's the Spanish grid operator, Red Eléctrica de España, otherwise known as REE, described these 0.2 Hertz oscillations as normal. Now, we don't know what the amplitude or size of these oscillations was, but I've put an example here on the slide of what that could look like. So let's say the frequency was otherwise stable at 50 Hertz. It never is in real life, but for the purposes of this example, let's assume that was the case. And then we can see over the period of 5 seconds, you have a small 0.05 Hertz oscillation that takes 5 seconds to go to its peak and do a trough and then go back to zero. Now, Red Eléctrica described these oscillations as normal and not a sign of instability. And I'm not sure that I agree with that. We will have things, cyclists running red lights in London is normal, but it still poses a risk to pedestrians and it's still illegal. So I wonder whether tolerating these types of anomalies on the grid, just because they've become normalized, doesn't necessarily represent stability. Anyway, at around midday, a different frequency oscillation emerged, and that was at 0.6 Hertz, so a faster oscillation. And this was deemed to be unusual. And again, there was also a drop in voltage associated with that frequency oscillation, and the voltage also began to oscillate. So this meant there were waves of high and low voltage rippling through the grid. And these oscillations can make equipment behave unpredictably, which is essentially what the problem was in Spain. So Red Eléctrica observed the drop in voltage and really targeted its efforts on addressing that voltage drop, didn't really do very much about the oscillations. And its response to the drop in voltage was pretty much to employ static measures. Now, to begin with, those static measures appeared to work. The oscillations damped, and they took almost 5 minutes to damp in the first instance, but they were damped. However, a few minutes later, they reappeared, and when they reappeared, RE just wasn't able to respond effectively. Now, to compound the problem, this all happened in the middle of the day when there was so much solar generation available that prices actually went negative. And when prices went negative, so that basically means you have to pay people to take your electricity away from your generator. So a lot of solar plants then decided to switch off because they didn't want to pay money to generate electricity. That makes no sense. You want to sell the thing that you produce, not have to pay to get rid of it. So many of these generators were connected to the low voltage distribution network, and the system operator can't see that generation. All it can see is the impact it has on the high voltage transmission system, which is what the system operator manages. And so it looks like a big increase in demand because so basically the demand was always there on the low voltage grid, but it was being met by local generation. But when that local generation went away, that demand then was sent through to the high voltage grid, and very suddenly REE had a lot more demand to manage than it had expected, because this happened pretty much instantaneously. All of these solar farms just turned off. Now, REE started to make various instructions to both wind and solar and conventional generators to follow instructions in relation to the flow of reactive power. Now, unfortunately, a large number of both solar, wind and conventional generators failed to follow these instructions and basically didn't comply with their grid code obligations. To compound that compliance failure, a lot of wind and solar generators tripped off despite the grid still being within acceptable operating parameters. So this is a major compliance failure. This is called a failure in fault ride-through obligations. So all generators are supposed to be able to withstand small faults without tripping off. And a large number of wind and solar assets failed to do that. They tripped off prematurely. Now, all that loss of generation, notwithstanding the increase in, alongside the increase in demand, caused the system frequency to fall, because system frequency rises when you have more generation than you have demand, and it falls when you have more demand than you have generation. So you'd had a demand increase and you had a reduction in generation, and this caused frequency to fall. And then the frequency, so much of this happened that the frequency fell outside the acceptable grid parameters, and that triggered then a lot of conventional generators to trip. So this wasn't a compliance failure because the frequency had gone below 49.5 hertz, which is the 1% margin that they're supposed to work with. And so you'd expect that once you go below that level, you'll start to get disconnections. And in fact, that's what happened. Then you had interconnection tripping, so that caused the Iberian grid to be islanded, so isolated from both Europe and Morocco. Then after that happened, you had more gas, nuclear and hydro generators tripping off. The grid frequency fell far below the levels at which equipment was able to operate. Voltage fell to zero and there was a full system blackout. So effectively, this 0.6 hertz frequency oscillation that had an associated voltage oscillation and voltage drop was the cause of the Iberian blackout. But that's a little bit too crude an analogy, because fundamentally so many things didn't comply with their grid code obligations that it was almost inevitable that the grid wouldn't be able to cope. So the key messages that we can take away from this report, I'll put myself back on camera for this. So the key messages that we can take away from all of this are this fault, the 0.6 hertz oscillation, was actually traced to a solar inverter. So it was a single solar PV plant that caused the grid disturbance that caused the Iberian blackout. So in that sense, you absolutely can trace this back to renewables. Now, as I just said, that's a little bit of a crude analysis because a lot of other stuff went wrong as well. So number one, you had a badly behaving, malfunctioning solar inverter. Then you had inappropriate disconnections of wind and solar generation, and the widespread failure of reactive power support, both in conventional generation and in wind and solar. The system operator, Red Electrica, employed static controls when it should have been looking at more dynamic responses, because this was a dynamic situation, it wasn't a static situation. The grid code non-compliance actually went further, because RE itself had non-compliant transformers, which had also tripped off inappropriately at various points in this day. And overall, the collapse exposed the systemic risks that you have with low inertia grids and high levels of inverter-based resources and inadequate voltage control. And what we've always had in our power grids has been a big focus on frequency. Frequency has been used as the measure of whether a grid is stable or not. It's been the primary lever, if you like, for system operators to manage their grid stability. We have here in Britain the National Energy System Operator petitioning Ofgem to allow it to reduce its minimum inertia holdings and move to a more battery-based approach to inertia, because that aligns with net zero ambitions. But what we're seeing from Spain is that a simple focus on frequency is not enough to guarantee grid security. And where you've got such widespread compliance issues with inverters, relying on inverters to provide these essential grid services would be extremely dangerous. So the key takeaways are, number one, poorly configured inverters can cause catastrophic grid failures in weak grids. Number two, more attention needs to be paid to voltage control and not just managing frequency. Number three, we need to have much better monitoring of grid code compliance. In most countries, grid code compliance is tested when an asset is first commissioned and then never tested again. Essentially, they wait for something to go wrong and then they fine the generator if they're non-compliant. We saw this in 2019 in the blackout here in Britain. Two big power stations, Hornsey 1, which is a wind farm, and Little Barford, which is a combined cycle gas plant, both failed in their fault ride-through obligations, and they were just fined after the fact. Nobody was checking as they went along that they were able to meet these conditions. And then number four is that the normalization of deviance often leads to disaster. Now, this is a well-known theory when you come to looking at disasters. It was famously deployed in analysing the Challenger spaceship disaster. Effectively, NASA had been accustomed to launching space rockets that had these faulty O-rings, which were the component that failed with Challenger, and they'd just become used to it. They were like, yeah, this O-ring, we know it's a bit dodgy, but we don't think it'll fail because it hasn't so far. And then obviously it did fail catastrophically, and something like 7 astronauts lost their lives. So the normalization of failure leads to complacency. You think that you can live with this stuff. You think that, oh yes, these dodgy O-rings or these 0.2 hertz frequency oscillations that we see on the grid, they're normal, they don't cause blackouts, everything's fine. And that's true until it's not. And so it becomes very dangerous to start accepting these things as okay. Normal and okay are not the same thing. So fundamentally, system operators, regulators and energy ministries need to ensure they're not so blinded by their net zero goals that they compromise grid stability, particularly in allowing a gradual erosion of standards that eventually exceed what grids can cope with. 11 people lost their lives in the Iberian blackout, so it's really important that the right lessons are learned to avoid any further repeats either in Spain or anywhere else. So I hope you found that interesting. I know some of that was a bit technical. Please leave your thoughts and comments below. I've actually written a couple of pretty technical explanations, much longer than this video, on my blog, so I'll put links to that in the description as well. And as I said, if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them, and I hope you found all of this interesting. Thank you.